Welcome back to Intersection. This is a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan McMillen, and today we're talking about the changing role of money in politics. That's the topic of the documentary Citizen Koch, which is showing at next month's Citizen Jane Film Festival in Columbia. Joining us in studio, Paula Elias is the co-director of the Citizen Jane Film Festival. Joining us by phone, Lessin is the co-director of the film Citizen Koch. And joining us by Skype is Richard Reuben. He's a professor in the MU School of Law. We'd also love to hear from you and our audience today. Please give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet us at intersectkbia, or you could join our online chat. Okay, so coming back to the issue we skipped across as we wanted to talk about Citizen Jane since that's coming up. But Richard, I think I heard you ready to jump in on Tia's thoughts as we went into the break. I wanted to give you a chance to jump back in there on what she was talking about, the role of money in politics, again, being the issue we were talking about.
Yeah, the point that I was going to make is that the real issue here, in some respects, is a principle that the Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed, and that is that it offends the First Amendment to in any way equalize speech, and when it comes to political speech. And so this is the reason that the Supreme Court, particularly led by Justice Kennedy, who's a very influential member of that court, this is really the reason that. That the court has adopted this approach. It's very much of a black and white, colorblind kind of an approach. It suggests or it assumes that all people are created equal. Now I'm including corporations and trade associations. And the reality of that, as we know in so many different contexts, simply is not true. And so the the response that you'll get from those who support this, including Floyd Abrams, who is a First Amendment absolutist. There are no exceptions in his view. Um, the argument that you'll hear is, well, you still have every right to speak. The problem is being heard. When somebody else is spending, you know, $3.6 million to have their voice heard, and you've got 1,000, you are not going to be heard as your voice will simply be drowned out. And so this is without question the direction that the Supreme Court is heading, not just with independent expenditures, but also campaign contributions. In other words, throughout, for the entirety of campaign finance, they just don't believe that Congress that Congress should have the ability to regulate this kind of speech. And so I look forward. I mean, just looking in my crystal ball, when we have people like Tia doing the important work that they're doing, and Paula giving it the proper air that it needs. My hope is that we'll see a constitutional amendment proposed in the states, within the next decade or so, once people realize what has happened.
All right.
Um,
Sorry. And Tia, it's a good time to bring up an interesting background on how your film came to be, talking about the voice and also where it was going to air. There was a little bit of a hiccup. I doubt that's the right word you would use. Could you explain a little bit about how the funding situation went and some of the things you learned from that experience?
Sure. Well, we've been filming for about a year or so when we approached public television with a pitch for a film, and we were looking to get funding and a broadcast partnership for our film, which at that time was called Citizen Corp. And we actually got the great news last April of 2012, that we got the green light from public television executives. They loved the film that we were making. They saw work samples, they saw cuts of it, they saw written proposals, and they were hoping, they were not only committed to giving us $150,000 in funding, but also hopefully a broadcast slot on one of the big series that airs independent documentaries like ours. for 2014. So we were working with them in partnership with them, and we were on track for public broadcast until this agency withdrew its financial support and its partnership for our film. And we were stunned by this, and it became clear why they had done this. Initially, they first asked us or made some demands that we take the word Coke out of the title of our film. And then they asked us to scrub some of the content, so it was de-emphasize the role of the Kochs in the film. These billionaire industrialists who are spending $400 million in the last election cycle and largely helped to bankroll Scott Walker. They were entirely relevant to the story that we were telling, and they also personified big money in politics, both the money of individual billionaires and also corporate interests, because they own this corporation called Koch Industries. So we were open to changing the title, frankly, and we were certainly open to making changes in the film. But then we realized where these demands were coming from public television executives. It turned out that David Koch, one of the Koch brothers, was on the board of two of the largest PBS affiliates in the country, WNET in New York and WGBH in Boston. And not only that, he had made large contributions to both his affiliates and to public television as a whole. And apparently, WNET took offense to a program that had been aired earlier that was critical of David Koch and threatened the public agency that was funding our film. And after that, they started to get very nervous, and then they withdrew their support. This is all documented in an article written by one of the foremost investigative journalists of our time, Jane Mayer, and in the New Yorker magazine. And what she discovered was that David Koch was on the verge of making a 6 or 7-figure donation to WNET when all hell broke loose and WNET threatened this public agency, and then we started to get pushback on our film. So we were sort of stunned by all this. We had counted on these funds, and we had also counted on the public television broadcast for this film. And while we were having these conversations about their editorial demands, they were also saying things like, "We love the film. We think it's a terrific film, and we can't wait. When we want to fight for the broadcast. The problem is there's people with power, and they have power, and we have to essentially placate them." And we thought this wasn't right. We certainly were happy to make changes to the film, but we thought that we couldn't, with integrity, make changes because of fear of a powerful donor to PBS. It just seemed wrong. So we spoke out. We told this investigative journalist, and as a result, we lost our ability to get this on public television. Probably burn that bridge. But we educated the public about the very big power, the oversized influence that big money has, even on our public media. We all know the power that big money has in our elections and our public discourse, but we didn't realize that it could even shape the editorial and programming decisions on public television.
Sure. And in that article, from what I've seen on reporting on this, to be fair, that it sounds like that it hasn't been documented that there was any actual request from David Koch to have this change. It may have even been a case of self-censorship, from what I understand.
That's right. Well, in fact, that's even worse. I mean, in some ways, it was even sort of more disheartening to know that that these public servants, these people who are getting public monies to fund and curate documentaries, took it upon themselves to censor our film because they were trying to make a broadcast partner happy, a broadcast partner who was cultivating a large donation from David Koch. So in some ways it's worse. That's kind of the problem with big money in politics. These politicians don't need to get phone calls, from corporate interests. They don't need to get direct threats. All they need to know is where the money's coming from. And then, we fear that their agenda is in part shaped, they're not responsive to the agenda of the voters. They're responsive to the agenda of the funders. And that's why this big money in politics and in media is destructive.
Okay. Actually, we just have a comment from a guest I wanted to bring on. I think it probably is one of Paula's responses here. So the comment from the guest says, looking forward to Citizen Jane. Previously have seen some quite thought-provoking films. Women-led films nearly always stay with me longer than other types of films. Would very much like to see Forbidden Voices in the shorts.
Yeah, Forbidden Voices is going to be really incredible. I got to see that down in Florida, and it's an amazing film about Yanni Sanchez, blogger from Cuba, and as well as a woman from Iran and a woman from China, and working within a government where they're trying to speak out and they're getting shut down. And it's interesting. We think about those as being pretty strict kind of governments around free speech, but apparently it's kind of here too. So, just in a different way. But yeah, Forbidden Voices is a great film.
Okay. We also have a comment from Lodi. Actually, first I wanted to mention that we just brought on a new guest. Denise Lieberman is a senior attorney at the Advancement Project's Voter Protection Program. She's based in St. Louis, and she follows some of these issues on the state and national level. Denise, thanks for joining us by Skype this afternoon. Denise, you there?
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'll bring on this next comment, and Richard, you're on Skype as well. So this comment came from Lottie in the chat room. She said, the well-funded minority drowns out the majority. Thomas Jefferson said, democracy is cumbersome, slow, and inefficient, but in due time the voice of the people will be heard and their latent wisdom will prevail. He says, unfortunately, that's not true any longer since the average citizen does not think for himself or herself. I wonder, maybe Denise, that's a good time to bring you in and maybe talk a little about some of the research you've seen and who gets a voice in democracy right now in the U.S.
All right, well, that's an excellent point. The concern that we have with the American Legislative Exchange Council and the contributions of the Koch brothers is that it eviscerates our traditional understanding of how democracy works. That indeed our lawmakers are responding to concerns of their constituents, concerns of things that are happening in their communities, and they're crafting legislation to be responsive to those concerns. And that is not necessarily the case. The Koch's influence through the Legislative Exchange Council crafts model legislation outside of the state of Missouri, outside of local interests, and farms those into the state. And we see this happening all over the country.
Right. And Richard, I wonder your thoughts on that, too. We haven't really talked about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, much yet. But, yeah, talk a little bit about the role they have in forming legislation. You mentioned earlier the state levels where we see a lot of the impact of this big money.
Yeah. I think there's real reason for concern right now, given the disparity of power in being able to get one's message out, and this is really where democracy gets distorted. The fundamental idea, of course, is that all of us participate through our elected representatives at the state level, at the local level, at the national level, and if really they're not listening to us, then we don't really have democracy. I'm not exactly sure what we've got, but it's not democracy, and so I think it's really important, starting at the national level, but certainly working its way up for people to educate themselves, and to insist that media outlets like this give time to alternative voices. The problem is that with the monetary spigots open, it's very difficult for those who have alternative views to be able to fund their presentation, and so this is a challenge for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Denise, maybe you can take a step back for us here and tell us a little bit more about ALEC, because we kind of jumped into that really quickly for people who may not be familiar with ALEC and some of the work that it does.
Sure. Well, the prominence of the American Legislative Exchange Council really came where, after the 2010 midterm election, when conservative majorities took over legislatures around the country, making it much easier for the organization to promote its legislative agenda. But in fact, the American Legislative Exchange Council has been around since the 1970s. And they describe themselves as a public-private membership association of state legislators that is funded significantly by its corporate members. In particular, the Koch brothers. Charles Koch sits on ALEC's corporate board. And the Koch brothers have given millions of dollars to the American Legislative Exchange Council. And the key way that this works is that the corporate interests and lawmakers sit down together and craft legislation that they want to see promoted. But the reality is that the corporate interests on ALEC's board have veto power, and they meet in secret prior to presenting their legislative agenda to lawmakers, and indeed sort of take the bill writing obligations away from these lawmakers, present them with model legislation that they've decided will advance their interests, and through a variety of incentives, strongly encourage those legislators to push that legislation through in the state. And one major example of this is the sudden proliferation of voter ID restrictions in states following the 2010 midterm election, where you saw some 38 states come to the table with photo ID bills that were nearly identical. And this was not a coincidence. This was not something that was happening organically in the states in response to reports of widespread voter impersonation fraud. Rather, this was model legislation that was being farmed out by the American Legislative Exchange Council and promoted by their state members.
And what are some other examples of the type of legislation ALEC has been trying to spread throughout states? Richard, maybe you can help us with this as well.
Well, I'll jump in here. I mean, the quote unquote right to work legislation that eliminates collective bargaining for public employees and really curtails the rights of working people to bargain over wages and to bargain over safe working conditions and to really sustain their own unions. And to contribute to local candidates. And those that right to work legislation is being passed in every state house around. In Michigan, a month after Scott Walker a month after Barack Obama won the presidential election, that right to work legislation was championed in Michigan, of all places, for the birthplace of the UAW, and they won. And the group, in addition to ALEC, the group that also helped to champion that legislation was Americans for Prosperity, which is a political organizing nonprofit of the Koch brothers.
I need to take a moment to remind our listeners that this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan McMillen, and today we're talking about the changing role of money in politics. That's the topic of the documentary Citizen Koch, which is showing at next month's Citizen Jane Film Festival in Columbia. Joining us in studio, Paula Elias is the director of the Citizen Jane Film Festival. Joining us by phone, you just heard from Tia Lessin, the co-director of the film Citizen Koch. And joining us by Skype is Richard Reuben. He's a professor in the MU School of Law. And on the phone, Denise Lieberman is the senior attorney at the Advancement Project's Voter Protection Program. For you and our audience, do you think there should be campaign contribution limits in Missouri? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet at intersectkbia. That is one thing we haven't. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to add something. This is Tia again. You know, what really struck us when we were on the ground in Wisconsin filming, this is not a partisan issue. This is really a transpartisan issue. And what we were struck by was a widespread protest that Governor Walker had provoked. These are not just union members, and these were certainly not just Democrats. It was a groundswell of citizens from both political parties and independents as well, and also non-voters who felt that Walker was betraying Wisconsin's legacy of democratic values. So, really, though the Republican Party seems to be benefiting right now the most from the Citizens United decision, it's really extremists and the wealthiest who are really seeking to gain from this.
And Denise or Richard, feel free to jump in on this, but do you expect the right to work bills and voter ID, which we've been talking about, do you expect those ALEC-driven bills to come back up next year?
I absolutely do, and I look for more. I don't know exactly what they might be. Denise is closer to the ground than I am, but as long as they have the money and power to promote that legislation, it certainly sets the agenda. And this is the advantage of having all the cards. And that's why I think it's really, really incumbent upon the media. I think it's incumbent upon citizens to arm themselves with more information and um, uh, to work together to make those voices heard.
We have a comment from the chat room that reflects that. Says true democracy requires participation, requires in all caps.
That's absolutely right. And I'm going to echo Professor Reuben's response. We could most certainly expect to see legislation for representing ALEC's agenda come up next year. We already expect to see a cumbersome voter ID bill, as well as a proposed ballot initiative that would change our Constitution to obliterate provisions of our voting rights to come up in 2014. And, I think that most citizens, most voters, most Missourians would probably be surprised to learn that the legislative process was being usurped in this way, that it would be sort of so easily bought and paid for. Many of us probably are cynics and know that big money plays a role in our politics, but I don't think people expect that outsiders are actually writing the legislation that is driving a primary agenda here in Missouri. I think it goes against what most Missourians feel is the right way for democracy to work. People are offended by the idea that politicians can manipulate the system for their gain. And even more so, that private interests can do so behind the scenes. And that's the concern with what is happening here.
Yeah, we have a comment to that effect from Artie in the chat room as well, saying lawmakers do not craft legislation, lobbyists craft it. Lawmakers just push it through at lobbyist bidding. Lobbyists are all about excluding people, not including. But these organizations we're talking about, legally, they get that are in control of all this money. That the money is being donated from many times these large donors. There aren't many restrictions. There's really no oversight when it comes down to it. Tia, I know that comes up in your film, and Richard and Denise, it's something you guys are talking about on a regular basis as well.
Well, and the American Legislative Exchange Council doesn't even present itself as a lobbyist. I mean, at least if they were doing that, there would be something that was upfront about it. Their agenda would be out there, know where they stand. But in fact, many of the contributions that they're making to their members come through the sort of so-called charitable scholarship funds. Much of their agenda setting is done in private, behind closed doors. They don't promote themselves as actual lobbyists. Rather, they go through the legislative members to promote this agenda sort of on the fly in the dark.
And to be clear, the Supreme Court is tacitly endorsing this process by interpreting the Constitution in a way that the Supreme Court never has in the past. In the past, the Supreme Court has historically upheld the kinds of limitations that the Roberts Court is striking down. So, you have to understand that this is a product of conservative judicial activism. I mean, it's activism, and it's conservative activism. And, because we're dealing with constitutional issues, a mere act of Congress cannot correct it. And that's why the hope that I see is that through the work of people like we have on this show, Tia in her reporting and Paula in her producing and Denise in her on the groundwork, that it's going to be the people themselves and say, hey, I want a voice again. And the way that that'll happen, that the only way that can happen, at least in law, is through a constitutional amendment. And it takes a lot to get one of those through, but um, we'll see.
Tia, is that close to what you were trying to accomplish here, getting that voice out?
Well, we wanted to document what was happening on the ground, and we hope that our film can be useful to organizations like Denise's Advancement Project that are working so hard to make, to restore our democracy. We showed the film last week at the U.S. Senate, and two members of Congress, actually Senator Sanders and Representative Deutsch, who are sponsoring a constitutional amendment to essentially nullify Citizens United, had us up there and sponsored the screening in hopes that this film would help them, educate the public. And we know that hundreds of communities around the country have passed resolutions advocating for a constitutional amendment. There are certainly other ways that folks are going about trying to change things. But I think we know that people are sick and tired. They're really fed up. And what I hope happens is that people get re-engaged and make changes. But the other alternative is that people just get, withdraw from the political process and feel, more cynical than ever and more helpless than ever. We can't really. I hope we don't let that happen.
And Denise and Richard, one thing, we just have about a minute and a half left before we have to end the show today, but one thing we didn't talk about, Missouri specifically, is the campaign contribution limits for individuals, which do not exist at the moment. One of the few states that has that. There is, I think you mentioned earlier in the show, though, Richard, that there's an effort to change that. What do you think about the possibility of that going back on that change?
Missouri has gone back and forth on this. I think that right now we won't be seeing any movement back toward campaign finance regulation, especially if the U.S. Supreme Court, as I expect, begins chipping away at campaign contributions or federal entitlement to, or the federal authority for Congress to have campaign contributions. Missouri is already at where the Supreme Court wants to be.
Okay, Denise, what are your thoughts on it here in Missouri specifically?
Yeah, I defer to Professor Reuben on that.
Yeah. And Tia, how about you? Your thoughts on these campaign contributions, and again, is that what you're seeing from your film, that is where we're headed?
You mean the direct contributions?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that, as Robert said, they're chipping away here, and look, I think it's important to point out that the Supreme Court, is a very activist court, and Justice Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, ran one of these nonprofits that filtered this money. It's a very activist court, and it's a very politicized court, and I think these decisions really need to be questioned because of the lack of integrity of justices, particularly Justices Thomas and Scalia.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you very much, Tia, and thank you for listening to Intersection. Thanks to our guest, Paula Elias, the co-director of the Citizen Jane Film Festival, Tia Lessin, Emmy Professor Richard Reuben, and Denise Lieberman, the senior attorney at the Advancement Project's Voter Protection Program. We'd like to remind those of you enjoying this as a rebroadcast that Intersection takes place live for a full hour from 2 to 3 every Monday afternoon. You can watch live streaming video of our program each Monday afternoon online at kbia.org. Alongside that video, you can submit your questions and comments and take part in an online discussion with others in the audience. Intersection is produced by Raymond Tungakar, Janet Saidi, and Reuben Stern. Travis McMillen is our technical director with production assistance from Rachel Gangware, Casey Morell, and Andrew Yost. Hayden Akers is our audio producer. Executive directors are Mike Dunn and Mike McKean. I'm Ryan Muellner. Thanks for joining us.